starting now just because we know we've had a few people. Yeah, thanks, Steph. And I think you bring up a couple of really valid points there and certainly it's quite topical in the news at the moment about protective factors around vaping or also the similar protective factors that happen in other parts of young people's worlds. So whilst we're talking about vaping tonight, potentially a lot of the strategies and that I'll be discussing will actually work around other risk factors as well. You are going to get an opportunity at the end of this to do a quick survey to tell us what you thought of this. It's always a lot tougher to present online, but it's always a lot nicer for you in the evening. As well as that, we will be placing resources on the BATForce website under our community wellbeing dashboard under Launchpad Parent. We'll send you out, anyone who registered, out a link to that, which has got other resources with information around vaping. There's a heap of other information in there as well. So yes, I want to acknowledge the 6 local governments and Barwon Health, Timboon District Healthcare, South West Health and Colac Area Health for their support for this project. Projects like this aren't easy because you're dealing with geographic boundaries, but as you said, vaping something that's a bit of an equal opportunity employer when it comes to boundaries of local government. We just want to make sure that we can start the conversation at the point we're at the moment. We'll talk a little bit about what that point is now. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lee. I've been working at BATForce for 20 years this year, 35 years in the youth industry, presenting with young people, families, parents, carers and schools. So I'm going to move around a little bit in this presentation to give you a little bit of information about vaping. There's certainly a lot more information out online that you can Google. What I'm going to do is adapt that in how we have conversations with young people, but also talk a little bit about the surveying we've done so far to give you a bit of a sense of what we've learned. Whenever I begin any presentation, I always start with, and I did this morning, presenting with a group of Year 7s all the way through to every presentation I do. Whenever we're having conversations with young people, I think it's really important to create that space where we have the time to speak, the time to think, the time to respond, the space to be different. So I always say to the kids, I've even got friends at Barry for Collingwood, it's completely okay, and we can agree to disagree. Young people today who are growing up, especially with what they're seeing online, things like that, are facing this real binary decision. You either like one thing or the other, that we can actually agree to disagree on a number of different topics, but continue to have conversations that move. So letting people come into a conversation, find their space, and then continuing with an inquisitive mind to how we go about that. So we've talked a little bit about that. Steph's introduced the Barwon South West Vaping Project. In a nutshell, it's to reduce or prevent the uptake of vaping amongst young people from 12 to 25. Of course, whatever we implement in that space, we would hope would have a flow-on effect to other parts of the population. What I do want to point out right from the beginning is you are the experts on your families. These are just tips and tricks that we've learned along the way working with young people. So being really mindful that you are experts on your family, you take this away and apply it in a way that works for your family. Okay, so how are we going about the Barwon South West Vaping Project? 1, surveying the community across a really broad range of areas, and I'll show you a little bit of the data that's come in already. Running some co-design workshops with young people, which has already started across the region. Running parent-carer workshop, which we're ticking that box tonight, and we're going to run a professional development for people who work with young people later this week. And there'll be work that comes out of that. So this is kind of like phase 1 of the work. So this is where we gather all of the information. So you get an opportunity after this. You all got sent the survey link, but you get an opportunity to feed into that, and your responses help inform that work. Really mindful that there's a whole heap of research that's come before us. So this is being open to that research, not creating new. So far we've surveyed 563 people, and that's age groups 12 to 25. We've done that 12 to 15, 16 to 18, 18 to 25, working with young people, parents, carers, educators, community members, other. I use other because some people have chosen some quite descriptive language to explain who they are, so I've grouped them together. It makes up about 1%. As you can see, a really large part of the population that we've surveyed so far are that 12 to 15-year-old age group. They're kind of like a bit of a fish in a bucket for us, fish in a barrel, because we can capture them at school. Where we really want to push this out is to those 16 and 18s and 18 to 25. So if you've got young people in your world in that space, other parents and carers, you've got the survey link. We'd love it if you could push it out if you're in the Barwon South West region, so we can get that numbers on. Mainly because Steph and I are having a bit of a competition. She's got a youth survey going for something else and she's beating me at the moment. So with your help, I can start to bring back some of those numbers. What have we found so far, just with the small snapshot we've got? We asked a couple of questions on the survey, and I'm not going to give you all of the information because we haven't unpacked it all as yet. But when we asked that simple question, do we think there's enough information out there about the harms of vaping? Being really mindful that as adults who are working with young people, we're seeing a slightly different information set to what young people are seeing. Assumption is that schools are the place that all information goes out through, but this is a whole of community effort. Young people are only at school for a finite amount of time, and we're really pushing more and more education in the schools, which is a real challenge for teachers to be able to pull all of that off. So it's got to be a whole of community. So what we might be seeing as adults on our social media might be very different to what young people are seeing. The TV, the podcast, what we're listening to is very different. So it's really important we hear from the whole of community. And as you can see, most sort of 33% are sitting there saying that they think there is enough information out there, but the really early stat that we've got to look at is 47.1% don't feel there's enough. And speaking to young people, it's really interesting. I'm getting really quite mixed messages in that space. When we ask the question around, do we think young people know how harmful vaping can be overall? It's really interesting. And I've done a lot of work with adolescents and, done a lot of work with adolescents, and often our perception of what we think young people think, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute, can be very different to how they're thinking. So we've got a real mix there. So we know that 42.6% of people surveyed so far believe that they've got enough information, but it doesn't stop them doing it. We know by definition adolescents are risk takers. They do have an invincibility gene that sadly as adults we begin to lose. So that sense that, okay, we need to get the community feeling like that they do have those skills to do that. And thinking back to some of the key health messaging we had growing up, how can we get to a point where, community feel like that there's that safety and security around young people? They do have that information, but I'll let you can read that for yourself. So we can see 21.5% think they know a little bit, 20% think they know some. So really varied there, but I think the main one for me on that is I think they know, but it doesn't stop them. So it's not about giving them information. That allows us to drill down into how we're giving them the information and how we're giving them the tools to use that information in an informed way. Because we've got access to the internet, but the reality is now with the access to the internet, we do have access to information. It's about choices we make and how we use it. Why it's important you're here? Because you're the experts on your families, but also you've got really clear insight into your communities. We can't be everywhere at once. So if you've got insight into your communities about something that's working really well or an area that is showing higher vulnerability in key messaging, getting in touch with your local government and saying, hey, I think this is an area where we could really use some support. And if you get onto the Vaping Project page, which will send you out at the end of this too, that'll show you who the people in your regions are that you can contact. So in talking to young people about vaping so far, I just got a couple of really quick snapshots which summarise where young people are sitting with key messaging across the board. When we talk about to young people, whether I talk to them about cyber safety, vaping, whatever it is, I hear this over and over. A lot of the education stuff we get and a lot of the messaging says don't or no, but it doesn't answer the why or why not. And I think that's really important. Being inquisitive when our young people have questions about vaping, things like that, not just doing that binary yes or no. I always say when I'm running parent and carer in education forums that as your children get into adolescence, finding that space that works for you and your family where your children stop asking permission and start asking your opinion. When we get opinions, we start to get more information. Yes or no might be a final, but that comes after opinion. When we get yes or no, it doesn't inform that why or why not. So that's something that young people are saying. Over and over, I've been hearing in forums, and we ran 4 student forums at the end of last year, and every group in those 4 student forums said the same thing. When I said, well, at the end of the day, when we look at vaping, we look at all the technology that's around, all of that, they're adult inventions that we've failed as adults to put the guardrails up against, whether it be through legislation, whether it be through early education, getting onto these things early. The access was easier than what it should have been for young people. And when you sort of say to young crew and you give them the magic wand and say, what would make it easier for young people to maybe avoid these sort of risk-taking things that can harm them, over and over we hear in very different types of language, but we hear we need adults to have better boundaries around us. And I think that's really important that we hear, because it reminds us that young people do want boundaries. My best on ground so far is a young fellow, when I said, well, what's one thing you reckon we can do to stop young people vaping? And he said, just tell kids they've got vitamins in them and that they're good for you, which I haven't beaten that yet, but I thought that was a really cute one to put in there. So we start looking at what a vape or an e-cigarette is. My assumption is if you've joined on today, you've probably done a little bit of homework on this anyway. So we're going to talk a little bit about what a vape or an e-cigarette is, because definition is really important. And we're now seeing another generation come out, FOOMs and mods and all of that, which are actually a similar looking device, but it's not a heated device. So when you start to see, and some of you may have seen on social media, you start to see these things which are really good for you because they help you stop snacking or they help you stop vaping, and they've got essential oils in them. And because we have essential oils in our home, the assumption is, well, they have to be good for us, but they're still going directly into the lungs through these new things. They're not considered vapes or e-cigarettes. Vapes and e-cigarettes are very much the heated product. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So how does it work? What we know is that it's got really clear definition in how it works. It must have a heat or a tobacco heating or a fluid heating device somewhere in the device, which we call a vape mod. The heating element, the coil, atomizer, which changes from oil into vapor. You inhale it, obviously, through a small mouthpiece. Some of these are rechargeable. Some, what we do find, though, is if some young people, if they've learned how to pull these apart, they can put other products in these too. So just being really mindful of that. The term e-juice, I think, would be enough to turn me off vaping, but the e-juice is a combination of chemicals without or with nicotine, and that can be problematic. So starting to think about, it's got to have that heating element. Some of the new ones, which will have a coil in them, they'll be cotton or a synthetic. They're tending to advertise the synthetic ones because I think they're polyester, because the cotton ones, there were some concerns around inhaling. But remembering FOOMs, things like that, which have these essential oils, still have to go directly into your lungs. So really important that we're across some of the models that are coming out following this. So you might have your tobacco heating devices, that still counts as an e-cigarette. So some of the names we got from young people so far: e-cigs, vapes, e-hooks, vape pens, mods. You can learn these. It's a little bit like learning text talk. By the time you learn it, there'll be a whole new set of terms. Best thing to do is make your children the experts. I always used to say to my kids growing up, oh, I've got this friend and they said at their kids' school, kids were doing this. What would you do if that happened at your school? Or is that something you've heard of in your community? And you'll find out very quickly what your children know about it without actually asking them directly. That gives you a real sense of what's going on. I'm just admitting a few people as we're going. And like all true projects, I think just about the week the project got announced, the legislation changed. So that was a challenge in itself. But we know in July that the laws did change around vape and vape products. Whether they contain nicotine or not, they can only be sold by a pharmacy for the purpose of helping people quit smoking. And some of you might see the term cessation of smoking. If you're not familiar with that, same sort of thing. So to manage nicotine dependence. So looking towards doctors and getting scripts, things like that. Herein lies a problem, though, because as soon as we make some legislation, we tend to get a legal distribution of these products, whether they're getting them online or still through tobacco shops. In the town I live in, where I live in a very small town, and even the tobacco shop in our town, when they have chop, which is the illegal cigarettes, you can tell when they're at the shop because there's a Q70 people out the door for it that day. And I live in a very small town. So, whilst we know that, yes, the legislation's there, that's part of reducing it because it makes it more difficult. But because of the online world we live in now, there still are ways that these are coming up. It starts to create some problems with us because the problem with illegal vapes is there's no minimum standard of labelling. So if people are buying illegal vapes or e-cigarettes, they don't always have to list all the ingredients. They're not going through a TGA approval stage. Vapes were never approved by the TGA. But if they're getting illegal vapes or e-cigarettes, just things to be really mindful of. A, we don't know the ingredients. There's no control over the testing of the ingredients or what happens when they're mixed together. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. They may still contain nicotine regardless of the labelling, and they don't always, if ever, display the harm warnings. So just being really mindful if you are seeing illegal vapes out there, that it's good information to have with your children and great conversations to have with young people about, what are the pitfalls of getting things illegally that we just simply don't know what the ingredients are. I love a good history lesson, and I think this is a good starting point. It was interesting when I asked young people when they thought vapes started, and there was a really broad range of answers. But originally, with best intentions, they came out of a pharmacist who invented them purely as a way to start to look at how they could deal with bringing people off cigarettes. Obviously, as soon as the technology is made, people find other ways to do it. And I noticed I come down to Victoria every couple of months, and I'm not usually in crowded towns, but when I'm in crowded towns, I've noticed when I'm walking the streets now, I'm not smelling those really strong fruity flavours of vapes, things like that I potentially was 6 to 8 months ago. So we are seeing a little bit of shift there already. My concern is the vapes that are robust enough to pull apart and people put things in themselves. Young people like to experiment, and that's potentially a conversation that needs to happen at home. So it was introduced in Australia in 2007 with very little guardrail, if any, around it. What we know about the tobacco industry, we had, decades of research, and you go back and watch shows like Mad Men and things, and shows that are made back in times when people smoked all of the time. I'm old. I grew up with cigarette smoking around me as a child. It was not uncommon for us to go down to the shops and get cigarettes for parents. Things like that. I've spoken at schools where teachers my age have said if they finish their work early, one of the teachers would send them down the shop with a note to buy cigarettes for the teacher. We've seen a massive shift in that 5 to 6 decades with the research. We know about the chemicals that are in cigarettes now. We know the harm to lungs. Vaping, we simply, we know some of the short term and some of the long term, but we've still got a long way to go to get that research. And Stephen Broderick's done some great work through Hopkins University, through the Charles Hopkins Uni in the US around that. And I'll talk a little bit to some of that in a minute. So what we know is TGA vapes are not approved as a therapeutic, as a smoking cessation tool. There will be probably a few more guardrails coming up now that they're being prescribed. But at the time, over the last couple of years or since 2007, there was no TGA around it. So if we look at the science, and I've spoken to young people about vapes in a whole heap of ways, and we can go in there and we can talk about harm, but I think the simple message that often gets lost, and it's fantastic if you've got a science teacher in the room when you do this because they can back it up with some really good work, but the really simple starting point for me is that a lot of the chemicals that they see in vapes are actually in some parts of the world passed because they're okay on your skin or they're okay in your stomach. Now, when we ingest food, obviously we've got loads of chemicals in our stomach which can cope with those and it can break it down. There's some really brutal things in our stomach that will cope with having some of these things when we ingest it. When we inhale the chemicals, that's a very different situation. It goes into our lungs that simply don't have those chemicals. Young people who are just starting to grow, going into adolescence, things like that, they're breathing a lot, they're moving around a lot, certainly if they're playing sport. So protecting our lungs is really critical. It's very difficult to reverse some of the impacts that things like those chemicals what happens when those chemicals get together. The other point that I like to talk about with young people is that when we heat a chemical, it changes compound. So often the chemical that it's written, the way it's written when or presented on a box or on a set of instructions may be a really different chemical when the compound is heated. And the next one on that, obviously, is if you've got combinations of chemicals by themselves, they might heat up to something very different to when we pull those chemicals together. Petrol sitting in your shed works really well. Fire in your backyard works really well. If the two get together, not so great. So starting to think about those, what are the really simple things we can talk about? A, the difference between ingestion and inhaling. B, the fact that when we heat chemicals, it really changes what it's doing. And if we heat them and combine them, we simply don't know all the impacts. The Gen Vape report, which is readily available online, I'm happy to send people links of that. And there's been some really great work out of Western Australia, which has looked at the combinations of a whole heap of these chemicals and found out some really good stuff. But they're still very much in the finding out stage about that. But if that's how we can simplify those three conversations down. You're probably wondering why there's a picture of broccoli on your screen. Yes, I am that technical. I suppose when I talk about a product and when we use it in different ways, how it could potentially create harm, and broccoli seems like as good a place as any to start. Yes, we'd all eat it. When I present it to some young people, they'll say they eat it, but they hate it. But yes, we would eat it. Would we rub it in our eyes? Probably not. Why? Because it's not meant to go in our eyes. Would we inject it into our veins? We would probably get ourselves in a bit of trouble if we injected broccoli into our veins. And would we inhale it into our lungs? So starting to get young people to think about it. Some things can be completely okay on surface value, but in our lungs, they're going to be a very different product. And I'll go down to vitamin E at the end to talk about why we have that conversation. So when we start to think about some of the chemicals, and I've just pulled out a few, there are loads and loads of chemicals, but when we start to pull out a few, diacetyl, this is a food additive that's used to deepen e-cigarette flavours. It's known to damage the small passageways in the lungs. If anyone's had microwave popcorn at home, that really strong flavour you get, the diacetyl's in that, and it's usually used to make that food smell nice. Okay, now when we eat it, it doesn't do any damage to our stomach because our stomach can ingest it. But what we do know, which I'll talk about now, and I'll skip the slide later, is that there was a problem that they were starting to see in vapors that they'd seen in people who worked in the factories where they made the microwave popcorn. And that was the fact that they were breathing in really large amounts of the diacetyl, which was the flavouring that was used. And they were calling it popcorn lung. They started to see people who were presenting with damage of lungs with this popcorn lung phenomena. And it's suspected that it was pretty much proven now that it is related to the fact that diacetyl just simply is not built for your lungs. I'm not saying don't eat microwave popcorn. It's fine in your stomach. Just maybe don't inhale it. Formaldehyde, pretty much by now, anyone who's been to a museum will see the brain sitting in the fluid, the formaldehyde. It's a toxic chemical that's used to stop proteins breaking down, which is why we can put small animals, brains, things like that. When we start putting that directly into our lungs, we're really going to look at a really fast track in getting it into our bloodstreams, things like that. Acrolein, which is used in my favourite weed killer, it's a chemical that also can be present in some of the vapes, especially those flavoured vapes. So the flavours might sound great, and we've certainly had students when I've been presenting, and I don't know about the other presenters yet, who are saying, oh yeah, but they're just fruit juice because it smells like fruit juice. So we're talking about these flavoured ones. And that's when we go to vitamin E. You know, most of us growing up, vitamin E is something that's great. You put it on your skin, works really, really well. So vitamin E seems like something that's not going to be harmful. You know, in doses you can ingest it into your stomach. We know that. But when it's delivered directly into your lungs, it's really quite toxic. So getting people to think about, yes, these products may have a space in other spaces in our body, but in our lungs simply don't have the capacity to fight them off. There's just not the acids there. So these are the really simple things I've picked out to try and start to tell a story to get young people to feel a little bit more informed about vaping. Given some good examples there. Slasher, my weed killer of choice, has the acrolein in it and obviously formaldehyde. So as soon as I show young people that, they go, oh yeah, they know what that is. Okay, I've listed some of the potential health impacts. We could go into this a little bit more. If you do want to know more, there's stuff on health.gov.au. We know that irritation to mouth and airways, that out of breath, persistent coughing, the nausea and vomiting, which is also something that's interestingly coming up a lot in our focus groups around tobacco pouches, which is one of the other things to keep an eye on at the moment, which they can buy online. They're all over young people's social media. There's little packets of tobacco that they put up in their lip. If you're a golf follower, you'll notice professional golfers are often putting them up in their lip. There's a whole heap of reasons why they're doing it, but the nausea and vomiting is something that young people are reporting from this too. The headache and the dizziness, seizures from inhaling too much of the e-liquid. Remember, it's really hard to know how much of a vape you've had compared to a cigarette. I'm certainly not saying for a second cigarettes are better in any way, but it's hard to measure. If you ask a vapor how much they vape a day, very difficult to measure that compared to someone who can tell you how many cigarettes they've had. The burns or injuries when vapes overheat or explode. If young people are getting access to nicotine, obviously that chemical dependence on the nicotine. If they're using other things like the fumes, which aren't a vape as such, things like that, you may be risking your sort of behavioural things of needing to constantly use something. As they get older, they might start drinking alcohol. That we need to know that what that can continue to, because the patterns matter. That's really important. Feeling more stressed or anxious, breathing problems, and harming brain development as they grow. So there are significant potential health impacts, and they're all on the health.gov.au site. I'm not going to list them all, just we don't have all to do that. So the two that I've sort of picked out here are that the vaping can cause a myriad of issues. Vape tongue's one I like to talk about, and that's that loss of sensation in the tongue. When you're talking to young people, you sort of mention what would that be like if you wanted to really kiss somebody and they all go, oh, your tongue's really important all of a sudden, or when you're trying to taste food, things like that. So vapor's tongue can be something that happens. And the popcorn lung, as I discussed before, which is the bronchiolitis obliterans, is that BO, that rare condition that can damage the small airways. There's been a couple of reports of athletes over in the US, college-level athletes, who have had popcorn lung or hard lung, and basically that's the end of their careers. Their game's over for sport. Being good athletes, they've got really good lung capacity, so they're drawing it right the way down. So when we start to think about what influences young people's decisions to vape, now, I probably presented 60 to 70 sessions in schools last year, and then more often than not, by grade 5, grade 6, most young people are on the internet. Most young people are starting to play around with Snapchat, Instagram. They're following YouTubers, and depending on what games they like is really going to decide where they're going with that. So finding out what our children are doing online is not only beneficial for other reasons, but finding out where they're getting their information from. And sometimes, if you have a great relationship with your child, having a look at their For You pages, things like that on their different apps can start to give, or their different platforms can start to give you a bit of a sense of the type of people they're following. Just because I research and I look up, I have the search history of a 14-year-old, different things. I noticed as soon as I'd finished doing some stuff, looking at vaping and snooze, I was getting hammered with all of the new modern fumes and different products that were coming out. I've still got those going around on my sites. So starting to think about, well, what are the things that are informing what our young people are doing? When we start to think about that, and I'm not discarding education, parenting, that I'm going to come back to that because it's far more critical than you think. I think parents and carers tend to think that once they get to high school that young people are far more interested in what their peers got to say, but we know, especially around gambling and alcohol, that parental attitudes really matter. So your attitudes will always matter for your young people, and that's really important to remember. I talk to young people a lot about their authentic self versus fitting in. From year 5, 6, you start to talk and they start to think about what's going to happen in high school. I did not have a session for year 5, 6s last year where at least one child didn't put their hand up and say they practiced not going to the toilet at lunchtime. so they wouldn't have to deal with vaping. They started practicing that in primary school, so when they get to high school, because they were worried about vaping. Because of social media, they have these fears about things in high school that a lot of adults didn't grow up with. One of the bizarre ones that always comes up is lockers, and then you start to unpack it. Most of the movies they've seen have got all the really negative stuff happens around lockers. So starting to getting down to our children's height and seeing how they see the world. When our children at that year 6 to year 7, year 8 mark are trying to develop self-agency and be their authentic self, we're throwing algorithms at them that can beat a chess master at chess. So they're being bombarded with images, they're being bombarded with information while they're trying to work out, how do I stay my authentic self? And I would often hear in a session, what's the stereotype about high school? Everybody vapes in high school. Everybody sends nude photos in high school. So starting to debunk some of the stuff that young people think everybody gets into fights. All teachers are mean. Hear that all the time. As a secondary trained teacher, I blame primary teachers for that. But we have a bit of fun with that. But yeah, starting to think about, how do we validate our child's authentic sense of self when our child decides to go their own way and not really go with that fitting in? This is all what my peers are doing. So finding every opportunity we can do to really, support our children to stay their authentic self is important. As I said, parental attitudes really matter. You're their first teachers and they're your best teachers and role models. As parents and carers, we can't fix everything, but we can create safe spaces to have conversations and enable our children to grow through their adolescent space. I call adolescence there, I'm not there yet. And that's really important, that yet phase, that adolescents make mistakes. By definition, they do. That's why they don't vote and drive. So they're not there yet. So we have conversations when they've tripped over, they've made a bit of a mistake. Okay, what you're telling us is you're not there yet. We need to put the guardrails back up. So starting to think about, as parents and carers, vaping sits here, tech use sits here, safe sex, there's so many different topics. So we don't want to start just throw in these, and this is really hard for schools because topics come at them. What we need is to work in really strong school partnerships with our schools and start to sit there and go, okay, how can we create those boundaries that our young people need with the safe spaces for emotional growth? That when our children make mistakes, if we do say no after hearing opinions and we say no, that we do create that safe space for that emotional growth. These are the protective factors that are going to support our children. I know there's a lot on social media at the moment with the show Adolescence coming out that, our children are going to test boundaries. Our children are going to be exposed to things, but we need to go, okay, what can we control? Boundary setting and safe spaces for emotional growth, and ensuring that they've got at least one significant role model or one parent who's actually got consistent boundaries in the home. These are the protective factors that we start with. Education, everything else wraps around that. This is the starting point. And I suppose when we think about a lot of the information our children get around vapes and other things, yes, they're getting from their friends, but a lot of it's being shared on social media, shared on their platforms, starting with that really basic line that, when our children go online, they've left the house. Now, any other day we would ask our children, where are they going, who are they with, and what time will they be home? So if we want to start to look at, okay, how do we create that safety, remembering that we have two very different value systems. Even this morning with some year sevens, what's the most important thing for your parents is that you stay safe. What's the most important thing for you? It's not always their top value priority. So bring those value conversations together. So finding out when they're going online, if they are being exposed to social media or being exposed to these new risk-taking tools like vaping, fumes, whatever's coming next, that you're actually got a little bit of boundary around that. We just talked about that worry. I want to show you this because we talked about perceptions. A lot of adults will sit there and say, well, they've got all this access, they're still choosing to make mistakes. Sometimes we have this perception of how young people are filtering things that doesn't necessarily add up with what I'm hearing from young people. Now, if I was to ask you now, I'm going to ask you if you can to get on your chat. When I ask young people, what would their future look like if they didn't have access to screens? Just jump on the chat now. What do you think their top answer is? For those of you who've seen me present this before. Just how I check if people are still listening to me. Boring? Disaster, yep. More time with friends, Mimi's getting closer. Disconnected, yep. So I'm just going to go after those three. I'll move through it because I really appreciate your time tonight. I've been asking this question for about 12 years now. And again this morning, the teachers were really shocked to hear their students say that young people would be happier, healthier, more connected, better concentration, less stressed. I love this one. I got this one last Monday, I threw it in, which was we'd have less friends, but we'd have better friends. So young people can see that if they had less time, if they had boundaries around technology use, this is what they would be like. So where they're getting exposed to these things is here. But when we set boundaries, what this tells us is young people really want boundaries, because when I ask them, why don't you just have less time now? They sort of say, scared of missing out. They don't want to be different. Fear of missing out is huge. So our job as parents and carers and schools is to put those boundaries around young people so they can achieve this. Most young people, when I speak to them in school, love the phone bans as long as it's the same for everybody. So when we look at vaping, things like that, as long as the rules are fair for everybody, young people are quite happy to follow the rules. It's when they're different for different people. Now, your risk takers are always going to push back. It's okay. That's what the boundaries are there for. So what does that mean for us as parents and carers, whether it's vaping or anything else, is to create those safe spaces with it. I get in trouble saying boundaries too much in my presentations, but I can't emphasise it enough. At the same time, we have to create that safe space where young people can have their emotions, that's safe and respectful. So an example of that is, kids will kick off if they're asked, no, you can't go out with your friends, or no, I found a vape in your room, we're going to sit down and have this conversation. Everybody kicks off, hey, I can see you're really emotional about that. All emotions are real and all emotions are valid. So as our young people grow, some of our young people can start to filter their emotions and regulate quickly. Other young people take time. So starting to think about, okay, I can see you're really upset because I've created that boundary. This is the space you can have that upset in. You can kick off respectfully in this space. So holding that space so they can have those emotions, because then over time they start to be able to regulate. When they don't is the time where you speak to wellbeing at school, have a chat to your GP, go to Headspace, have a chat to a counsellor somewhere. If you have realised over time those big emotions aren't starting to settle. And if you're someone who needs some support with helping with that boundary setting, that's really important, because you being able to co-regulate becomes really important when you're holding that space. So any conversation we're going to have with our young people is going to need that in it. So when we talk about boundary setting, we're talking about clear communication, setting the rules, limits, routines, checking for understanding. If you've made a choice in your family that vaping or drinking alcohol under the age of 18 is just a decision you've made, that becomes your boundary setting. There may be consequences. That's a choice for your family. You're the best teachers in that environment in your house. But start to think about the fact that your children should hear it, so they know that's the boundary, so they know what the guardrails they're beating up against is. Starting to think about, where are the spaces your young people are getting in trouble? Maybe that's where you bring the guardrails in a little bit and just say, hey, I'm not saying it's forever. It's just you're not there yet. So at this stage, we're going to work with the not there yet, and I'm going to provide you the support to help you get to that line. So boundary setting becomes really important. These are the tools you need to be able to have conversations about things like vapes. You have the conversations, but then if they know there's boundaries and they know there's really set rules around things, it becomes a lot easier. How do we hold space when things kick off? So when I say things kick off, your child gets very upset about a decision you've made that, they don't have to like all our decisions as parents. That's completely okay. Sometimes this means their big emotions are going to kick off. We need to create that safe space. Co-regulation becomes important. So if you're finding that everybody's getting upset, just saying, stop, I need to go away and calm myself before we can have this conversation. Okay? We invite them into our calm. We don't join their chaos. Hold that space, allow them to work through it. Becky Kennedy, if you have got children year 5, 6, 7, Becky Kennedy's book, Good Insides, fantastic book. If you've got primary age kids, it's fantastic. So I'm going to ask you now to, if you can, in the chat group, to start to think about What do you believe would deter young people from vaping, apart from telling them they've got vitamins in them and they're good for you? Is there something that you believe would deter young people from vaping? You might have seen something or heard something that's worked really well for a certain group. Just having a look and adding into the chat if there's something that you can consider. Make it seem uncool. Yep. And we've done that with other campaigns in the past too. Certainly it's worked with alcohol. We've seen this generation of young people are drinking far less than generations before them, mainly my generation, to be honest. 100% if their friends don't think it's a great idea. And that's where school education's a great starting point, but schools don't have them long enough and they can't spend the whole time focusing on that. Hearing from their peers and slightly older than them, yep, hero saying it's not cool. We'll be really mindful using sports players because we can't guarantee what their trajectory is going to be. But yep, hearing from people that they're their heroes, friends who don't vape, yep, all good protective factors. We've also got to be really mindful, though, that we often, as parents, sometimes I hear that parents get frightened because they do know that one of their friends does vape. As soon as we say, well, I don't want you hanging out with because they vape or things like that, or we say, okay, so how does that affect you? What would you do if they asked you? And not judging it. What we do know about young people, and we've got this research around technology, not so much around vapes, is their biggest fear is having devices take away, but their second biggest fear is you judging their friends. And they actually rate that higher than you judging them. So being really mindful when they don't have, if they do have friends that vape, that you tread very carefully on that conversation. Go, how does that impact you? How does it feel when they vape around you? How do you feel about saying no? Is that something we have to practice? Absolutely. Having a network around them that say no or don't like doing it, that's where having young people involved in sports, things like that, can be really helpful. So how do we create those conversations with our young people around vaping or any young people? Small long conversations ongoing. Picking one week where you're going to pick, right, we're going to talk about vaping this week. We need you to continue those conversations. Have you noticed out in the community lately, we're not seeing as many people vaping? Is that the same for young people that you know? Are you hearing less about it in your school? Make them the experts. They're really good at it. Creating that time to put money in the bank, having really pro-social or positive time with your young person so that when big ticket items come up that you do need to discuss and you need to take money out of the bank if you have caught them vaping, things like that, that you have got some positive time there that you can withdraw on. And if that means 5 minutes a day where nobody's on phones, there's no screens on, you're just sitting and hanging out and doing something your young person wants to do, which gets harder as they get older, is that's the money in the bank time that we then get to withdraw on when something does go wrong. Making your child the expert. What are you hearing? I'm hearing this from somebody at work. They said at their school, this is happening. What are you hearing out in the community? Are you seeing that people are starting to use these things? And, when we talk about the tobacco pouches, I did a focus group and there was quite a significant lot of group in there who played high-level sport. And they said because they've seen on TikToks that you can put the tobacco pouches in and it fires you up for your workout, that you'll actually work out better. So even at that higher level of football, we're seeing that people are still preferring to use this. We're certainly seeing it in golfers. So finding out what they're seeing. On your social media, are you seeing much stuff about this? Finding out, or what's the latest thing? Starting to think about that. Where they're going for their information becomes really critical. Knowing who that one teacher at school is that they would go to for support if they couldn't go to you. Something really big happens between year 4 and year 5. Year 4, they will dob on you for anything. They are brutal in year 4. Year 5, all of a sudden, they're working towards that. Don't want to rock the boat. It's really important what other people think of me. I don't want my friends to not like me. I don't want my parents to not let me play. They're processing that. Year 5, 6s tell us they're far less likely to go to a teacher with something because they believe they've got to sort it out themselves. So starting to think about where are they going for information and giving them permission. I've been in a position of a wellbeing coordinator before, and I can remember kids who'd come in when things were getting really, really hard, and I'd say, how come you didn't come in a bit earlier? And it was just not knowing you had permission. So our children need permission to seek help from people other than us. And that's tough, but as they grow, we want a bigger therapeutic web around our children. So if we can get our young people to seek help from somebody, if you've got something you can't talk to me about, who are 3 other adults in our world that you talk to? Who's that one teacher at school that you feel comfortable talking to? It doesn't have to be their form teacher. It doesn't have to be wellbeing. It's just that one connect. That teacher's job and skill set is to get them to where they need to go. And it's often not a teacher we think about. Find out where they're going. Having a shared understanding of family values. Get that your friends' families might have different values. And, young people growing up now, when I'm doing parent carer education sessions, this seems to be a big issue, that all families have different values. They always have. That's not something that's shifted. It's just young people are seeing the immediacy of it now. And those role models, as Mimi said, having really strong role models, clear house rules around visitors. And again, you know your house, you know how you work. We tend to, in our family, have a rule that the backyard is a safe space for young people. So if people are smoking or vaping, that they don't go out into the backyard, they go out the front door, because the young people have a right to have that whole house. If our children start seeing us say to people, oh, look, if you're going to vape, do you mind going out the front door? We just want to make sure the backyard. They see us using that language with our friends. That's a really good role modelling opportunity. So, and same with vaping in cars. People will tend to see it as less than smoking. They'll just have a quick vape to stop. Appreciate you need to vape, but do you mind going outside? We've got a no vape house. So if our children, that's the best role modelling we can do for our children, is get them to see that. Just a few conversation starters, and that is, when they start telling you something that they've found out in the community, or they might know, tell me more about that. That inquisitive nature becomes really important. Oh, yeah, I've seen that there might be some kids. Oh, yeah, tell me more about that. Staying, not judging, sitting, letting your child be the expert for a bit. And when they are faced with the fact that they might be going out somewhere socially where there are people in the group, right? Hey, I know you make good decisions and good choices. What are you thinking you might do? All of a sudden, this tells our children very clearly that we trust the judgments and the decisions they make. Now, there's sometimes when we do that with a really deep breath, I get that, and not all of our kids make great decisions all the time. But giving them that opportunity to tell them you trust, they remember that when they go to make choices. They may still make mistakes, but they will remember that. Access to trusted information. So we've had 535 people surveyed so far, as I said. Now, when we said where would be the best place for us to put messaging for young people, I suspect it was older people that said TV and radio, but when speaking to young people, there's a lot of young people who listen to podcasts too. Through other young people always comes up. Social media comes up always as number one place. Now, we're in a bit of a dilemma at the moment that the next couple of, in a couple of years' time, we might be facing social media as not a space. So we need to thinking a little bit more critically. How do we get information out to people if we're not going to have that option for young people? YouTube, we know 500 minutes of content's created every single minute, uploaded every minute on YouTube. It's a very busy space. It's very hard to moderate. When we're putting information in about vaping, when we're putting information in social media, we've got to be really mindful of what else that's going to lead them to. Websites are great. They already exist. How are they accessing them? And that becomes important. We've created Adulting 101 on our website, which is on a Trello board. So you can actually, if you download the Trello app on your young person's phone or device and press the star on it, the Adulting 101 can go straight onto their phone. And what we know is that's only trusted information. It's all, we have a look at it and we sort of write it as young people. That is co-designed by young people. The questions that we've answered on there are from young people. We've also got one for parents and carers. Education in schools absolutely is a mainstay, but we can't leave it all to schools. I don't think a lot of teachers went into being an educator to saying, I want to be a social worker, I want to be an expert on drugs and alcohol, I want to be an expert on this. Our teachers need time to teach. Yes, they've got people, we've got fantastic secondary school nursing programs in some schools, mental health practitioners in primary schools, we've got wellbeing coordinators, absolutely. But if we leave the education and just assume it's all going to happen in school, more often than not, it'll happen in a short, sharp series around vaping. We need families to continue that at home. So that school-family partnerships becomes absolutely critical. You know, you read newsletters, you see what the schools are doing, you communicate your concerns to schools, because we know that when we've got strong school-family partnerships, we've got a protective factor around young people. But that is what we're hearing on the survey so far, that that's the areas we want. But we need parents and carers to be part of that process. I want you to think now about some really good health messaging that you've seen over the years. I think TAC do some great stuff with their campaigns. Anyone in the chat, can anyone think of a really good health message they've seen over the years? It's really worked for them, or a young person? No? I think about If I think about the SunSmart, if I think about campaigns like SunSmart now, growing up, you know, it started to come in probably in the 80s when I was growing up. And if we start to think about, SunSmart's been a really good campaign because we've embedded it in sport, we've embedded it in schools, slip, slop, slap. Yep, slip, slop, slap. I tell you, not teachers, because teachers say no hat, no play. Seatbelt one. I can't imagine what it'd be like to get in a car without a seatbelt anymore. Whereas as a child, I grew up and it wasn't illegal. So starting to think about those campaigns, what's worked. And the fact is that we've been bombarded with the messaging in multiple different facets. We didn't just get it once. If I asked you all now, yes, you all know, 100% of you know the SunSmart message, yet I would guarantee at least 80% of you have been sunburnt in the last 3 years. Now, what that reminds us is that when we have these conversations with young people about vaping, it can't be just one conversation. It's got to be conversations as they grow, their peer groups change, and as their views on world changes. We've got to keep reminding them and bringing it up. So when we start to think about quitting or cessation, I'm not a massive fan of that word. It feels like an N's missing for some reason, of young people. What options are there out there for young people? What do you think young people what would drive them to consider quitting? And I think being actively involved in sport and activity is something that's a really good driver if they know it's going to impact on them. If I'm working with a sporting club, I'll always draw on the fact that it'll impact on performance. Absolutely. But that's not going to work for all young people. Those vulnerable cohorts who aren't connected to that potentially don't have that risk frame in mind. But starting to think, how do our young people know? I asked a group of, I think it was 23 to 30-year-olds about where you would go to quit vaping. Not one of them mentioned quit because they thought quit was for smoking, and they said young people wouldn't access it because it's not for young people. So starting to think a bit differently that, hey, if your child was vaping, hey, the journey to quitting is not a one-off thing. We know it can take time. We're prepared to go on the journey with you. It's not just, no, you're not allowed to do that. If you need help quitting, okay, let's talk about what some options are that we can support you with that. When we asked in our survey about access to support services for quitting, 45.2% said that they didn't know what was available to people for quitting. We actually had some people write in the survey response they'd like to quit, but they didn't know how. So how do we expose young people to that information about what's available? Starting to think about, and it might be as simple as you see something and you flick it to your young person on socials and say, hey, if you've got mates who are vaping, have they seen this? What that does is it challenges the algorithm for a start if they open it, but two, it gives them information to support their friends. So starting to think what's available. Now we know starting with a family GP just to get a general health check is really important. Quit lines there, school wellbeing, and schools are really well resourced to support you to connect to what you need. That's their job. Headspace, really great, another spot. Now on our resources, there's a resource in there around all of the different things you can add into that quit scenario as well. So look, I'm sort of getting through this very quickly because it's not as interactive as it would usually be, but I want to open it up for a chat at the end. But in closing, one of the things I want to focus in is, as a community, legislation takes time to catch up to any risks that we're taking out in the community. So when we start to think about the different risk taking, whether it be on social media, whether it be with drugs and alcohol, whether it be unsafe sex, all of those sort of things, unlicensed driving. You know, we know legislation takes a little bit of time to catch up because it moves very quickly. We're already seeing the tobacco pouches, snooze they're referred to, all different names. Where's zines? We're seeing these already with young people, and they're going to be really hard to detect because they sit up in the lip. But legislation is going to take time to catch up, especially in a global economy where people are importing them from other countries. As communities, we're left to put up the safeguards, put up the safety rails when legislation's lagging a little bit. So in summary, what I've got here is, you know, creating connection using boundaries becomes really, really important. So how do we create those connections with our young people? And that's practicing on the things that aren't important. We don't not sit and talk about things and then go, okay, I want to talk about vaping. We create that connection through other conversations. So then when we're doing the vaping thing, there's money in the bank. You know, that's safety, boundaries, safe spaces for emotions. Ensuring children have at least one consistent role model in their lives. Finding out who that role model is. You know, start to talk about, oh, when I was a kid, this was my role model. It was interesting when I'm doing some work with young people, some of their role models are YouTubers, things like that. These are people who work to algorithms, whereas most adults tend to have people who have incredible skill sets, empathy, things like that. Developing, I can't speak highly enough of the importance of strong school-family partnerships. If your children are in school, if your children aren't in school, finding other ways to connect them to community. We've seen that the average age people are dropping out of sport has reduced a little bit since COVID. We understand that sport and activity is expensive. Speak to your school about vouchers or local government about vouchers that might be available if that's an issue, but finding a way of connecting people back into community activities so they are surrounded by more people, they're having more safe or educated risk-taking opportunities. Again, finding out where they go for information, holding that space, learn the art of co-regulation. And if that means taking yourself away from a situation to get to your calm space before you can join the chaos, that becomes really important. You know, every time I get an aeroplane to travel for work, the hostie gets up and says, always put your oxygen on yourself before you apply it to your child. And that's really critical when we're talking about any risk-taking activities with our children. Vaping, whether it's vaping or anything else, is really finding our calm space before we start that conversation. So look, there's a landing page on our website. I'm going to get you to a survey first before I open the floor for questions. I am going to stop the recording before we do questions, though, if that's okay. So I will get you to do the surveys in a minute. On the landing page, there's more information about the projects, and that sits on the VATForce website. We'll send that out to anyone who registered with today. Launchpad Secondary on our website has information directly about vaping, and there's the vaping survey. If you registered for this, you would have received that survey. If you are interested in being involved in the project ongoing, at the end of the landing page on the project page on the VATForce website is an information piece you can fill out, which goes through to COG. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to open the floor up for conversations. But before I do that, I'm going to launch this. And I know it sounded pretty quick, but it's just really hard when you're not getting a lot of feedback from people. There's a survey that's just gone up. If people could fill this survey in, we'd really appreciate it, because it's a survey that assists us to be able to continue to better inform the work we're doing at the moment. Are you all able to pick that survey up on your screens? If you could fill that survey in on your device, if you can. If not, we can send a link through, but we'd really appreciate it. We haven't had any coming in. There's not saying any. Yep, thank you. They're starting to come in now.